All right, Shabbosai, good morning, or good Chodesh to everyone. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this month. In memory of Paul's grandmother, Dina Bas Pesach, and Paul's grandfather, Zechariah ben Zechariah, whose yahrzeits are both in the month of Adar. We hope, in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos will have an Aliyah and the families in Nechama. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Gabi and Shana Cohn, for dedicating the shir this morning, commemorating the 9th yahrzeit of Shana's father, Mr. Avi Strimber, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Alevi Zichron Livracha. We thank Moshe and Devora Wordesheim for dedicating this morning's daf, and Mazel Tov to Devora and Moshe for completing Mishnah Seder Zroim and Seder Moed. And Moshe with a special message of gratitude to his longest lasting Chavrusa Devora for her persistence and desire to learn. Truly beautiful. And to thank Michael and Rachel Terniansky, we welcome Michael back to the shir, for dedicating the daf this morning, commemoration of the yahrzeit of Michael's brother, Alan Avram Yitzchak ben Shimon Yaakov. Zichron Livrach, we open the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. And with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, an incredible daf ahead of us today. So the Gemara says as follows. We are picking up, today's daf is Pei Gimel 83, and we are picking up Amir Hashem on Pei Beis and with Beis 82b, 4 lines up from the bottom. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows. So remember, just to reorient ourselves for a moment, we were dealing in the Mishnah with an interesting machlokes about how to dispose of a Karban Pesach which becomes invalid. And interestingly enough, what the Mishnah really outlines for us is it depends on the nature of the invalidation. So, for example, if the Pesach itself becomes tamei, then halacha lamaisa it is burnt immediately. However, if the invalidation is not in the Pesach, but the invalidation is in the owners, let's say the owners become tamei, or some other external circumstance, then halacha lamaisa tu'ubar tzuraso, which literally means we allowed the form to change, which means we let the carbon sit overnight and burn it the next morning. Of course, in the case of Karban Pesach, as we saw, it doesn't literally mean next morning, but rather what does it mean? 2 mornings later, on the morning of the 17th, the first day of, morning of the 16th, the first day of Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara says as follows, Rabbi Yochanan says as follows, Rabbi Yochanan ben Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Af the Achar Zika. So we ended off yesterday's daf with the Gemara making a distinction about whether or not the carbon became Tamei before Zrika, after Zrika. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Af the Achar Zrika Nami Machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan says Machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, and the Rabbanon Tanakama, is even after Zrika. Va'az Rabbi Yochanan the Tamei, Rabbi Yochanan goes according to his reasoning, Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, Rabbi Nechemia Amru Davar Echad. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, Rabbi Nechemia said the same thing. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka had the Amram. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, that's what we mentioned in the Mishnah. Rabbi Nechemia Mahi, what's the position of Rabbi Nechemia which is being referenced over here? Desanya. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, Mipne Aninos Nisrafazu. Remember again, we keep going back to the situation of the chatos burned on the day of the consecration of the Mishkan, the Bayom HaShmini, after the death of Nadav and Avihu. Instead of eating the chatos, Aaron goes ahead and burns the chatos. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Nechemia says, why did they burn the chatos? Mipnei aninos, because Aaron was in a state of aninos. Lekach ne'emar ka'ila v'ha'aninos kila achar zrika havya. And I will say, aninos ultimately again is like a case of a disqualification which occurs after Zrika. And yet, halacha l'maisi, you see that they are still burning the carbon immediately. V'chi istaruf la'alter nistaruf. And yet when they burned it, they didn't wait until the next morning, but rather they burnt it immediately. Top of Pei Gimel. Rabba Mosif Af Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabba also adds Rabbi Yossi Haglili to this list of opinions. This anya, Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer Kala Inyan Kulo Inamadabre Ele B'Parman Esrafim Ubesiiri Han Esrafim Lisrof Pisuleihan Abeis Abira Velitin Lo Sase Alachilasan. So comes along Rabbi Yosef Lili, and he says, Kala Inyan. Now Rashi says over here, Kala Inyan Kulo, Kol Parsha Zu, V'chol Chatos Asher Yuva Midama, this entire parsha, this entire set of psukim, which we referenced in yesterday's daf, is talking about Paraman Esrafim, Siraman Esrafim, ultimately, again, that any type of carbon which became disqualified, and therefore has to be burnt, The halacha l'maisa it's burnt, as we saw yesterday, abeis habira, by the Beis Hamikdash, velitin lo saseh ala chilosa, and it comes to add an extra lo saseh on their consumption. Amrullah, they said to him, chatos shenichnas dama lifnai v'lifnim minayim. So we'll say, what about a chatos? Remember again, a chatos has a blood application, but that blood application is normally on the exterior mizbeach. The mizbeach hanechoshes. What happens if you brought the blood outside of the area where it's supposed to be? In this case, he brought the blood outside, right? Bringing the blood outside of his prescribed area actually means bringing it inside. How do I know what happens to that type of chatos? So this again goes back to the episode of Aaron after the death of Nadav and Abihu, where Moshe Rabbeinu was trying to understand why did they burn the chatos as opposed to eating the chatos. And one of the things that Moshe asks is it possible that maybe you erroneously brought in the dam inside of the Kodesh? To which the Gemara says, Mechlal, the inofik ihi, which we can infer from this as follows, that if they were to have taken the blood outside of its prescribed area, inami ayil dama, or they brought in, let's say they would have brought in the blood to the Kodesh, bisreifa, that Allah Chalamaisa, then the result would have been the requirement to burn the carbon. Rabbi Yochanan says, Damu basar chada milsehi, bailim milsachris. Rabbi Yochanan will say, no, both blood and meat, dam and basar is one entity, but disqualifications ultimately in the owners is something else. So I will say, so bottom line, halacha l'maisa, how do we paskin? Because remember, this last piece is actually very important, because this is a shaila in how you go ahead, or really when you go ahead and dispose of the carbon. So remember, everyone agrees that when you have a carbon that becomes disqualified, although I thought maybe what I would do with it is I would bury it. Kamashma, we don't bury it, we burn it. The shaila is, when do you burn it? Can you burn it immediately? Or must there be what's called tu'ubar tsuraso? Do you have to wait until the form changes, which again, for our purposes, means leaving it until the next morning. So we'll say, so listen to this. So the Rambam Paskins here on this halacha. This is in Hilchot. We'll focus right now just on Hilchot's Carbon Pesach. So the Rambam writes in Hilchot's Carbon Pesach as follows. This is actually in the 10th chapter, Perek Yod, Hilchot's Carbon Pesach, Halacha Vav. No, wrong halacha. Sorry, scratch that. Perek Dalit Halacha Gimel. HaPesach sheyatza miYerushalayim o shenitma ba'arba'asar yisrof miyad. So we'll say, so the Rambam writes, halacha l'maisa, if the Karban Pesach becomes tamei, you burn it immediately. Now remember, this is talking about Pesach, which becomes tamei on Erev Pesach. So something happens at Erev Pesach, burn it immediately. Nitmu habaylim o mesu o mishchus yideim, afilu nitmu o mesu kodem zrikas adam, manichin oso ad shetu'ubar tsuraso ba'achar kach yisrof. But we'll say, but essentially, that getting into all the cases, Rambam says, but if something happens with the owners, let's say the owners become tamei, or the owners withdraw from the carbon, so that this way there's effectively no group to consume the carbon, then what? Tu'ubar tsuraso. You leave it overnight, you burn it the next morning. Again, as we said, next morning doesn't literally mean next morning, because you can't burn disqualified kachim on Yom Tiv. So what it means is you leave it 2 mornings. You leave it until the first day of Chol Hamoed. Ze'aklal. I will say, here we go. This is the takeaway. Kol shepisula begufo, yisarif miyad, bedam o bebailim, tu'ubar tsuraso va'achar kach yisrof. So we'll say, bottom line, here is the klal. Any time that the disqualification of the carbon is in what he calls the guf ha-carbon itself, begufo, you could burn it immediately. You do not need to wait till overnight. Anytime the disqualification is either in the blood, now what that means is in the blood service. Either you took the blood out, you took the blood in, you took the blood somewhere it's not supposed to be, or the blood became tameh. Obviously this is all prior to Zrika, because after Zrika, we don't care what happens to the blood. So if the psul is in the carbon itself, then ultimately you could burn it immediately. But if the psul is in the blood, or if the psul is in the bailim, then tu'ubar tsurasa, which means we leave it overnight, and we burn it then. Good, we'll say that's the halacha l'maisa by karbanos. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. We'll say now again, it's some more carbon pesach. It's really incredible. Ha'atzamas v'hagidin, Mishnah. We'll say, listen to this. So the atzamas, the bones, gidin are sinews. So v'hanosar, and nosar is anything left over. Yisrufu b'shisha asar, are burnt on the 16th. So remember again, this means the first day Chol Hamoed. So it's almost bones. The common denominator amongst all of these items is that they're not consumable. So atzamos are bones. Gidin will discuss exactly what this case is, but these sinews and nosar. That both say nosar just means anything that's actively left over. Yisrufu b'shisha asar. So again, anything left over from the Korban Pesach, bones, gidin, nosar, you burn on the 16th. Remember again, when's the 16th? First day Chol Hamoed. Remember, we'll say, to be very clear, we know this, the only type of sacrificial service that you're allowed to do on Shabbos and Yom Tiv are karbanos unique for that day. So you can't burn any leftover stuff or any disqualified stuff on Shabbos and Yom Tiv. So anything leftover, stuff you can't eat, 16th. Chal tazayin lios b'Shabbos. What happens if the 16th falls out on Shabbos? So we'll say again, let's say first, which again, first day Yom Tov is Friday, right? Erev Yom Tov is Thursday, first day Yom Tov is Friday, first day Chol Hamoed is Shabbos. Okay, so what do? Yisif will be a Zayin. You burn it on the 17th, you push it off. She'enan dochen lo asa Shabbos v'lo asa Yom Tov. Because we'll say at the end of the day, the burning of anything left over is not docha Shabbos and Yom Tov. Not docha Shabbos. Beautiful. We'll say, watch this. We'll say, this is great. Watch what's going to happen over here. Amra Mari Baravu, Amra Yitzchak. Ramari Baravu said, Rabbi Yitzchak, Atzamos Kadshim, Sheshimshu Nosar. Rabbi said, listen to this case. So bones of Kadshim that were Meshamish Nosar. Now, Rabbi said, remember, Nosar means any meat left over after the prescribed period of consumption. Now, interestingly enough, the Nosar designation applies to marrow inside of the bones as well. Right? You could eat marrow, and therefore, again, the marrow inside of the bones become nosar. So listen to this, Rabbi say, Atzamos kachim sheshimshu nosar. So if you have bones of kachim, sheshimshu nosar means they service nosar. In other words, they contain nosar. Metamen es hayadayim. Ultimately, again, they are metami yadayim. Because it will say, so when you touch the bones, which service the nosar, it's as if you went ahead and touched the nosar itself. Nosar midirabanan. Ultimately, again, is metames hayadayim, goes ahead and conveys them. Look, if you look at Rashi, metames hayadayim, it's right across from Tosafos Eimer. Kinosar atzmo shegazur chacham shitmas hayadayim. Both say this is a rabbinic decree that if you touch nosar, your hands become tameh. Both say, watch this. What does the Gemara say? Hoil v'naaseh basis ledavar ha'aser. Incredible. So for those of us who are learning Smichas Chaver, our two worlds just collided. Right? Who would have thought? We're all saying, mamish. This is our sugya. So, because what happens it's incredible. We're all saying, sometimes in life, something happens, and you feel like the Ribono Shel Olam is giving you a kiss on the forehead, saying, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. I see how hard you're working. I see what you're doing. I see that you're plugging away. So I just want to I see everything that you're doing. I see everything. I see the muktzah. I see the Daf Yomi. I see everything. And again, that little kiss, he brings everything together in one line, in one daf, in the middle. That this daf could have easily have come, a few months earlier, a few months later, but here it is, mamish. The bones themselves become a basis ledavar ha'aser. So I will say, so remember again, to be clear, obviously the Gemara is not using basis ledavar ha'aser in a muktzah context, but rather is using it in a kodshim context. So halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara says, you see from here that bones, which ultimately carry nosar, become a base to the nosar, and to a certain degree take on nosar status as well. So therefore, if you touch the bones, your hands become tameh as if you touched nosar itself. So let's bring a proof to support this. Hatzamos v'hagidin v'ano. So yisfru l'tezayin. So we'll say, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said that bones, gidim, sinews, and nosar is burnt on the 16th. You don't burn it on Yom Tov, you burn it on Chol Hamoed. So the Gemara says, Hani atzalon seichidami. Now what's the case of bones? Ilema delesbahu moach. If you say that there's no marrow inside of the bones, lama b'sreifa. So we'll say, so why do I have to burn the bones? Nishdinhu. All I need to do is stratos. So we'll remember again, we'll see in just a moment, bones by Karban Pesach, of course, are unique, because remember, you're not allowed to break the bones of the Pesach. So we'll discuss this in just a moment. But the idea over here is, why do I have to burn the bones? See, if the bones don't have marrow inside of them, there's no din in burning bones. I could just simply throw them out. Elapshita de ispuhu moach. Rather, again, it must have marrow. It must have marrow inside of it. So the Gemara says, I amrit bishlama shimush nosar milsahi hui. If you say that ultimately, since the bone is that we'll call it service of nosar, or in this case what it means is carrying nosar, is significant. That since the bone carries the nosar, therefore the bone takes on a certain nosar identity and is burnt like nosar. Therefore, amati lahachi bo sreifa. Then I understand why the bones need to be burned as well. Eli amrit shimush nosar lav milsihi. But if you say that the service of nosar is not really significant, la'amalahu sreifa, then why do I have to burn the bones? Nat birinhu v'nechlas salam oachtido v'nisrefei v'nishdinhu l'dido. We'll say, so if the fact that the bone carries the nosar does not make the bone into nosar, so I have a much better idea. Let's break open the bones. Get out the marrow, so that way whatever marrow there is will be burned. And Allah Khamais, you could throw out the rest of the bones. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so remember again, I just say you can't break the bone. So remember, we're going to see that bepashtos, the prohibition of etzem lo sishberu bo, of not breaking the bones of the Pesach, is dafka when you're permitted to consume the Pesach. But bepashtos, after the window of consumption has closed, the prohibition to break the bones no longer is applicable. But we'll see that. Elav shmamina shimush nosar milsi. So I'll say, so the Gemara therefore says, from the fact that you have to burn the bones, that indicates to us shimush nosar milsihi. That quote-unquote service of nosar, which again more explicitly means the fact that the bone holds the nosar, gives the bone, endows the bone with a quasi-nosar status, and therefore, again, the bone must be burnt as well. Incredible. Amrilo. No. Maybe I'll say that just because the bone contains the nosar doesn't give the bone nosar status. V'chasavar, and maybe what they hold is bo, because shafila b'pasel. So I'll say, so maybe halacha l'maisa, when the Torah says ve'etzem lo sishberu bo, halacha l'maisa, you're not allowed to break the bones at all. That you're not allowed to break the bo because afilu b'pasel. That even after the meat becomes nosar, the marrow becomes nosar, you can't break the bones open to get out the marrow. So you have to go ahead and burn the bones. I will say, not because the bones take on nosar status, but why? Because there's no other way to get rid of, there's no other way to burn the nosar except to burn the bones. Here we'll say, originally the Gemara is operating with the havamina, that you don't have to burn the bones. You could break open the bones, get out the nosar, burn the nosar, just throw the bones out. Now the Gemara is suggesting maybe not. Maybe when the pasuk says ve'esam lo sishberu bo, the halacha is you can't break bones at all, whether it's kosher, whether it's pasul, and therefore there's no way to get the nosar out of the bones. Because there's no way to get the nosar out of the bones, that's why you have to go ahead and burn the bones. Afilu, so the Gemara says, afilu b'psul, is that true? Are we going to assume that Allah the prohibition on breaking bones for the current Pesach is even when the Pesach is no longer consumable? V'hatanan, we learned, aval amosir b'tahar v'ashover b'tameh eino savik esar boim. But we learned in the Mishnah, we'll say that's what? That if you go ahead and you leave over in a current Pesach, that's tahar, or shover b'tameh, or you break the bones of a Korban Pesach which has become tamei, you don't get malchus. Now, Abosai, that's pretty explicit of saying that what? That the prohibition of breaking bones, the prohibition of etzem lo sishberu bo, only applies to a Korban Pesach when it's consumable. Lo kashya, kansha haisa lo shasa kosher, kansha lo haisa lo shasa kosher. We'll say very interesting. What does it depend on? It depends on whether or not the Pesach ever was permitted. Did it ever have a shasa kosher? Was it ever kosher? So look at Rashi just a moment, Rabosai. If you look in the wide lines, 4 lines into the widest lines, haisalo shasa kosher, kigo nosar, yesh bo shviras etzem, lo haisalo shasa kosher, kigo nitma lifnei zrika, In bo shviras etzem. So also an interesting distinction the Gemara is making. That maybe halacha lemaisa, what it means is as follows. What it means is, if the Karban Pesach was fit, but subsequently became unfit, which is pretty much every case like that, right? It was kosher, but at a certain point in time it becomes nosar. Then ultimately again, the prohibition of breaking the bones still remains. But if the Karban Pesach was never fit, then Einach Inami, the prohibition to go ahead and break the bones, never devolves upon the carbon. So a pretty intuitive and logical distinction. So Man Tana D'Shani Le'Bein Shaislo Shasa Kosher Lo Haislo Shasa Kosher, who is the opinion who makes this distinction that Etzem Lo Sish Barubo will apply to a carbon forever as long as the carbon was initially kosher. But if the carbon was never kosher, then the prohibition ultimately of Etzem Lo Sish Barubo doesn't apply to it. Who makes that distinction? Rabbi Yaakovi. Disanya ve'etzem lo sish barubo. The pasuk says you should not break a bone in the carbon. Bo bekosher v'lo bepasel. It only applies to a carbon that is kosher, but does not apply to a carbon that is pasel. Rabbi Yaakov Omer. Rabbi Yaakov says, Haisalo shasa kosher v'nefsal yeshua mishum shviras etzem. If the carbon was kosher but then became pasel, the prohibition to break bones still applies even when it's pasel. Lo haisalo shasa kosher, but if the carbon was never kosher, ein bo mishum shviras etzem, then halacha l'maisa there is no prohibition. If the carbon never had a shasa kosher, there is never a prohibition of shviras etzem. Shimon says, echad zeh v'echad zeh, ein bo mishum shviras etzem. Shimon says, in either case, there is no prohibition ultimately of shviras etzem. We'll discuss that shita later. So both say, bottom line what the Gemara is suggesting is, maybe there is this, let's align ourselves with this opinion of Rabbi Yaakov. Rabbi Yaakov holds that halacha l'maisa, when the carbon was kosher, therefore again there's a prohibition to go ahead and break the bones, and then that prohibition will remain pretty much forever. See, even once the carbon becomes pasul, you still can't go ahead and break bones. And therefore, once the marrow becomes nosar, there's no way to get the marrow out of the bones. Therefore, the only thing you can do is what? Burn the bones. But if the carbon never had a shasa kosher, right? If the carbon was never fit, therefore, by definition, the prohibition of breaking the bones never devolved upon the carbon, and therefore, never devolved upon the carbon. We'll say, by the way, just to show you how intuitive this is, the Sefer HaChinuch brings down, why is there a prohibition of Etzem Lo Sish Barubo? Why can't you break the bones of the Karban Pesach? Why not? So the Sefer HaChinuch says something very interesting. He says, because the entire essence of Karban Pesach is, the entire essence of Pesach is, Chayiv Adam Liros Asu Kiyos Mitzrayim, to be a Ben Chorin, to be free. And we conduct ourselves on Pesach night like royalty. Sefer HaChinuch says, royalty doesn't break open bones and suck out marrow. That's not what royalty does. Royalty has plenty of food, right? Don't have to go out and get into the breaking of bones. And therefore, again, they don't do that. So which intuitively Rabbi Yaakov Shita makes sense then, because again, the only time the prohibition ultimately of Etzem Lo Sish Barubo will apply is when you can eat the carbon, because not breaking the bone is part of the etzem mahus of the achila. It's how you eat the Karban Pesach. So if the Karban Pesach is kosher, then it makes sense the prohibition applies. But if you can't eat the Karban Pesach, then it's intuitive that etzem lo sish barubo doesn't apply to it. Just an interesting aside. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Meisver is a kasha, kol atzamos hakodshim ein tu'unin sreifa. In general, any bones of sacrificial of karbanos doesn't require sreifa. Chutz mi'atzamos ha'pesach mipnei takala. With the exception of the bones of Karban Pesach, you have to go ahead and burn them because of a potential stumbling block. So the Gemara says, okay, hani atzamas heichidami. So what's the case when we say that the bones don't require sreifa of a carbon, but do require sreifa of a Karban Pesach? What type of bones are we talking about? Heichidami, ilem adlaspu moach, if they don't have marrow inside of them, lamaluhu sreifa. So we'll say, remember again, if bones don't have marrow, everyone's going to agree, leave it alone. Or we'll say, even by Pesach, or let's say there's a prohibition to break bones, you can't break bones, but the only thing that really ever requires sreifa is sacrificial meat. Right? So if it doesn't have marrow, I don't have to burn it. So the Gemara says, "El pshita de'ispuhu moach." Rather, it must be that the bone has marrow. We'll say first white line on the bottom. V'sakadaitcha. Now halacha l'maisa again. V'sakadaitcha shimush nosar milsihi. And if you hold it halacha l'maisa when the bone contains marrow, that's significant, and it endows the bone with a quasi marrow status as well. Atzamus kachim ein tu'unin sreifa. I'm sorry. Atzamus kachim ein tu'unin sreifa. So we'll say so. Manavshach. If you're going to tell me that we must be dealing with a case of bone with marrow, because if it doesn't have marrow, why would you ever have to burn the bone? And now you're going to tell me that halacha l'maisa, I have to go ahead and burn the bones of Pesach because they contain marrow, and containing marrow endows the bone with a quasi nosar status. So then why do I just have to burn the bones of Pesach? Why don't I also have to burn the bones of regular karbanos? Isn't the halach always the same? What's the case? So we'll say, interestingly enough, what's the case? If we look at Rashi, shematzan chalutzin, 3 lines off on the bottom of Rashi, shematzan chalutzin, kula masnisa mitukma, b'motze atzamas chalutzin kilomar shavurin, v'nechlatz moach shalahan. So we'll say, here's the case. I find a pile of bones. And what happens? I find a number of them that are broken open and hollowed out. That's what it means, chalutzin, hollowed out. Kilomar shvurin v'nechlatz moach mehen. So the bones are broken and hollowed out. So the Gemara says, now watch this, Rabbosai. So watch this. Kachim de'ein b'hay mishum shvira sa'etzem. So when it comes to regular karbanos, which again, Bible says by regular carbon, there's no problem with breaking bones, right? You can break as many bones as you want. So we assume what's happened over here. So when it comes to stam karbanos, we assume that when were those bones broken open? Right? When you stumble upon a pile of karbanos bones, right? They're broken, they're hollowed out. We assume, when were they broken and hollowed out? When? Before the carbon became nosar. Because people ate it. We assume people ate the marrow. So we assume that people broke open the bones, ate the marrow before the carbon became nosar, and that's why. Therefore, the bones have no status. The bones could just be thrown out. Assumption Pesach, but I will say you can only make that assumption that the bones were broken open and the marrow was consumed prior to it becoming nosar by regular karbanos. Why? Because you're allowed to break the bones. However, by Pesach, Atzamos Pesach. But I will say when it comes to Karban Pesach, where again, there is a prohibition to go ahead and break open bones, the basar dinehavu nosar hu dechalatzinu, it must be that the bones were only broken open after it became nosar, v'havalu shimush nosar, and therefore at that point in time, the bones serviced nosar, therefore took on a quasi-nosar identity themselves, uba'u sreifa, and therefore require sreifa. Interesting case. Rav Zvid said, no, what's the case? Hacha mayaskinon kigon shematzan siburin. But say, so Rav Zvid comes along and he says, no, what's the case? I find not just a couple of bones, I find a pile of bones. Shematzan siburin. Umehen chalutzin. And some of them, I will say, are broken open and hollowed out. Now, this is very interesting. Take a look at the top Rashi, page 1 of these. Rashi says, Shematzan siburin, ubadak el yonan umatzin chalutzin. So we'll say, here's the case. In this case, I have a pile of bones, right? I have a pile of bones. So we'll say, now, I checked the top bones, and some of the upper bones are broken open and hollowed out. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, umhen chalutzin, atzamos kachim. So when it comes to stam karbanos, de'in ba mishum shira sa'atzam, l'kulhu havu chalitz lehu va'achalahu v'lo ba'yisreifa. So we'll say, interestingly enough, when it comes to regular karbanos, atzamos kachim, look at Rashi, atzamos kachim, lo bo lemivdak tachtonim, ela atzamos pesach bo lemivdak kulutz. We'll say, all right, so listen to this. I come across a pile of bones. Now I'll say, I don't really want to go through the entire pile of bones to see what the story is. So what happens? When it comes to regular karbanos, and I see the top bones are broken and hollowed out. So now listen to this. Kachim de'in ba mishum shira sa'etzem. So when it comes to regular karbanos, where there's no prohibition to break open bones, l'kulhu havu chalitz lei, va'achalahu v'lo ba'isreifa. So we'll say, I could assume when I have a regular pile of bones of regular sacrificial bones, if the top ones are broken and hollowed out, I could assume that's what? That applies to the pile. And when were the bones broken and hollowed out? By karbanos, I have a right to assume that when were they broken and hollowed out? Before they became nosar. And therefore, again, the bones do not need to be burned, right? The bones have no nosar status, and we're good to go. However, atzamos ha-pesach, tiyeshpan mishum shviras ha'etzem, dilma hani dechalatzinhu, or lahanach lo chalatzinhu ba'isreifa. Rabbi, when it comes to the bones of Karban Pesach, again, I have a couple of issues. The bone was opened up and hollowed out, but does that mean that everything was hollowed out? In other words, I will say, doesn't mean that all the other bones were hollowed out also, doesn't mean that there's no sar in there. So essentially what the Gemara is saying is when you find bones that have to do with Karban Pesach, because there's so many machloksim over here. Machlokis number one is there a prohibition to break the bone after the window of consumption closes? That's machlokis number one. And over here, when you have a pile of bones, do the bones have marrow, do the bones not have marrow? Just burn it. Just burn it. That seems to be the conclusion that the Gemara is reaching. So I'll just tell you the interesting halacha over here, because I think it's very interesting. So what do you do with the bones of Karban Pesach? So now listen to this. So the Rambam writes as follows. The Rambam writes like this. He says, good. If you break this is in the 10th chapter, Parak Asiri Halacha Vav in Kilchos Karban Pesach. So the Rambam writes as follows. He says you're not allowed to break the bone of Karban Pesach. Afilu nifsal b'tuma v'yitzia kiyotzvem yeshom mishum shviras ha'etzem. So what it's very important. The Rambam says that even if the carbon becomes disqualified, there is still a prohibition to break the bone. But when is this so? Kisha haisalo shas hakosher v'nifsal. Avalam lo haisalo shas hakosher kigon shenispagel o shenasa machshav zman o machshav shinui Hashem ein bo mishum shviras ha'etzem. So we'll say this is incredibly important. So halacha l'maisa, the Rambam writes, the only time, like Rabbi Yaakov, the only time that there is a prohibition of shviras etzem is when the carbon was kosher. So if the carbon was kosher, ultimately again it then becomes possible, then halacha l'maisa, the prohibition of shviras etzem will still apply. But if the Karban Pesach was never kosher, let's say something just became invalidated about it, in that case, the prohibition of Shiras Etzem never devolves upon the Karban itself. So we'll say incredibly important, essentially adopting the position of Rabbi Yaakov. Good. There's a lot more. Again, there's a lot more to do. What type of bones apply to Shiras Etzem? But again, we don't have to get into that now. But I will say, bottom line, halacha l'maisa, just important to know, the prohibition of Shiras Etzem applies even once the window of consumption closes, assuming that the Pesach was kosher. But if the Pesach was never kosher, became invalidated, the prohibition of Shiras Etzem does not apply. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, Kalagidin Basar. So we'll say, remember again, what the next item in the Mishnah that was mentioned were the sinews, right? The sinews are also burned on the 16th of Nisan, right? After the window of consumption closes. Says the Gemara, Amrav Yehuda Amarav, Kalagidin Basar, Chutz mi gidei tzavar. In general, gidin, sinews of an animal, are considered to be meat, with the exception of the sinews of the neck. So apparently, again, the neck sinews are too tough. They can't be eaten. Therefore, it doesn't have the status of basar. Look at Rashi. Kol hagidin basar. Harehin ki basar v'nimra le b'pesach v'yotzei dechol. Now, I will say, now, this is actually very important. This is not just like simply an academic statement about that it's meat or it's not meat. It's very important. So remember again, when you go ahead, when we, Emirat Hashem, Shaltov Mitzlachas, will bring Karban Pesach, Halavai this year, so when you form a Chabura, so you have to make sure that there is at least a kezayis of basar for every single person who is part of that Chabura. Which means that you have to know which parts of the animal have the status of meat, what's called basar. So when the Gemara says over that gidin, sinews, are considered to be basar, this is very important. That means that could count towards someone's kizayis, ultimately of Karban Pesach. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, in general, gidin are called basar, with the exception of the gidin of the neck. They're not really edible. So the Gemara says, Tinan asam usfagin vanos yesru b'tazayim. So we'll say, remember, let's go back for a moment. The Mishnah said that bones, gidin, and nosar are burnt on the 16th, right? Anything that's left over, you burn on the 16th. So let's analyze this. Hani gidin hechidami. What's the case of gidin? Ile magide basar nichlinhu. So we'll say, I don't understand. If you tell me that gidin are basar, so just eat it, right? Eat it before the window of consumption closes. V'idi isosar, and if you're telling me that gidin are basar and they're left over, hanunosar. So we'll say, what the Gemara is asking over here is as follows. If you tell me that gidin are treated like meat, then why are gidin reckoned separately? Why are they mentioned separately in the Mishnah? In other words, the Mishnah says you have to burn any leftover bones, gidin, and nosar. Nosar means leftover meat. If gidin are nosar, if gidin are meat, so isn't it included in nosar? Elapshita gidei tsavar. Rather, it must be talking about the gidin of the neck. That must be what it's referring to. That Allah Lamaisa, the gidin of the neck, ultimately, again, which are not consumable, if they don't have the status of basar, so if they're left over, you have to go ahead and burn them. So if you say that even the gidin of the neck have the status of basar, that's why you have to burn it. But I will say, but ultimately, if it's not basar, then why does it require to be burned? In other words, we'll say, maybe I should bury it. Maybe I should just do something else with it. Generally, like we just said before, I will say, we just went through this whole discussion. Why do you have to burn bones of Karban Pesach? Why do you burn the bones? Right? Because of the marrow. Meaning you don't burn the bones because of the bones, right? Bones by themselves don't have to be burned. We're burning bones because we assume the bone contains basar. The marrow is basar. That's why I'm burning it. So I don't understand. If we're talking about gidin of the neck that are not edible, so then why do they require sreifa? To which the Gemara says, interesting. What did we say? The gid hanasha, the sciatic nerve. That gid. But watch this. This is incredible. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino noig ela ba'achas. Rabbi Yehuda says, by the way, both this is wild. Gid hanasha does not apply to both sciatic nerves. The biblical prohibition of gid hanasha only applies to one of the sciatic nerves. To the nerves on one leg, the Gemara says, and I'm pretty sure it's the right leg. By the way, it's interesting. How would you say that the gid hanasha only applies to one leg? So let's say there's actually a very simple reason. What's the simple reason? Because Yaakov Avinu was injured in one leg. I was supposed to say the prohibition of gid hanasha comes from the episode of Yaakov and Saros Shel Esav. Yaakov was injured on one side. Now again, remember the prohibition. There's a whole discussion in general with learning out prohibitions. Yerushalmi brings down a principle of ein lemeidin davar mikodem matan Torah. That in general we don't learn binding halacha before Har Sinai. But again, leaving that aside, so Rabbi Yehuda has this idea that gid hanasha only applies to one leg. V'adas machras, and I'm pretty sure ultimately it's the right leg. So the Gemara says, so therefore maybe that's what we're talking about. Maybe the gid in the Mishnah is actually the gid hanasha. The gid hanasha. Now I will say, now remember again, with the gid hanasha, one of them is permitted, one of them is prohibited. Now I will say, now by the way, it must be, even Rabbi Yehuda himself is not totally sure. When he says adas machras, that I think it's the right leg, he's saying I think, but he's not saying it for sure. So ultimately, because we'll say if he was sure, then what? You should be able to eat the one that is permitted and burn the one that's not. Lama lisreifa. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so the fact that, now remember, Rabbi Yehuda is essentially saying that the gidin mentioned in the Mishnah that you have to go ahead and burn is the gid hanasha. And even Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that even though one of the gidin hanasha is permitted for consumption, we're not sure which one, and therefore what do? You burn both. So we're not sure which one is actually basar. In other words, we'll say, technically speaking, I don't have to burn both. Right? Because one of them is basar, one of them is not basar. But I'll burn both because I don't know which one is permitted, which one is prohibited. So the Gemara is suggesting that's the gidin in the Mishnah. Or it could very well be that even if you do know which gid, let's say Rabbi Yehuda is right, and let's say Rabbi Yehuda is definitive, and he says the right one is permitted, the left one is prohibited. But what happened in your Karban Pesach? You went ahead and you had both gid in there, the right one and the left one. And what happened? You confused them, which we could assume could pretty easily happen with your gid hanashas, right? And therefore, again, you confuse them. So because you confuse them, therefore you'll burn them both. So the Gemara says, Ashi Amar, no. Lo nitzricha ela l'shmano shel gid. No, that's not the case. First of all, say, in general, we don't pass like that, Rabbi Yehuda. We know the prohibition of gid hanosha applies to both legs of the animal. And then even Rashi says, no, what's the case? The case is l'shmano de gid. The case of also is actually the fat surrounding the gid hanosha. Now this is actually very interesting because I will say, technically speaking, the fat around the gid hanosha is permitted. Very interesting. The fat around the gid is permitted. So watch this. This sanya, here we go. Shmano mutter. So we'll say, listen to this. The fat around the gid is actually permitted for consumption. The Yisrael kidoshim heim. I'll say, what a beautiful statement. How apropos to read this statement on Rosh Chodesh Adar, a new beginning, his Chadshus, Erev Shabbos, Parsha Shkolim, so many wonderful things happening in the universe and happening in our neshamas. And to have a reminder, right? This is a reminder. The Yisrael Kidoshim Heim. It's a reminder, I will say. We are Kidoshim. The Yisrael Kidoshim Heim. Benoagim bo iser. So I say this is wild. So really, the fat around the gid hanosha is actually permitted. But Yisrael Kiddushim Heim, we are Kaddish. And I will say, by the way, how does Kiddushim manifest itself? This is incredibly important. The Gemara makes a statement, Yisrael Kiddushim Heim. How does the Kiddushim manifest itself? By going above and beyond what is expected of you. We'll say that's Kiddusha. Kiddusha means exceeding expectations. Kiddusha means going above and beyond. I'm obligated to do X, I do X plus Y. That's what Kiddusha is. It's such an incredible yesod because we talk about Kiddusha all of the time, but sometimes we can't wrap our head around what it means. Here it is. Yisrael Kiddushim Heim, I exceed expectations. I go above and beyond. So therefore the fat is permitted. The fat is permitted, but we don't eat it. We don't eat it. I want to point out again, don't confuse this to mean chumras. I mean, this happens to be a chumrah. But what it means is that again, I'm only obligated. I only have to check in, right? I just have to check the box. That's all I have to do. But I choose to exceed expectations. Not because I have to, but because I want to actualize my inner kedusha. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, so maybe, interestingly enough, the gidin that's being referred to in the Mishnah that you have to burn is not gid anosh, and it's not anything else. It's actually, interestingly enough, the fat that's around the gid. Now, why does that work well for us? That's a great definition. Why? Because that's actual basar. That's actual meat. So, but we don't eat it. Even though I can eat it, we don't eat it. And therefore, when burning it, we burn it like regular noser. So the Gemara Ravina says, "Bechitzon ukid Rabbi Yishmael." I'm sorry. Rather, it's talking about Bosai. It's actually interesting. There are two different gidin. There's. We'll see in just a moment. We're talking about the outer gid, which is technically consumable. Beis gidin hein. There are actually two gidin. Pnimi hasamoch la'etzem aser. So we'll say the gid that is inside, closer to the thigh bone. That's the gid hanosha that is actually aser. V'chayav and alav. And if you eat it, you're chayiv. Chitzon hasamoch lebasar. There is another gid, ultimately again, that is more external and closer to the meat. Aser. Ultimately, that is aser. Ve'ein chayav and alav, but one is not chayiv. So we'll say, interestingly enough, it's quite possible that the Mishnah speaks about gidin is talking about this outer gid. This outer gid, which in fact is fit for consumption because the prohibition of gid anosh halacha l'maisa is only on the inner gid. So therefore, I will say, again, as we work our way through the Mishnah, so we define the case of atzamas. Now we defined the case of gid, and now we didn't define it in one way. We have a number of different interpretations about how exactly gidin works. Is it the inner gid? Is it the gid hanosha? Gidin basar? Gidin not basar? But bottom line, I will say again, halacha l'maisa. Just you should know, we do accept. Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh Deah does bring down this idea that by the thigh there are actually more than one gid, and it is the gid that is closer, really on the thigh bone, close to the thigh bone, that halacha l'maisa goes ahead and is prohibited, but halacha l'maisa, the gid that is external is permitted. We'll pick up a mirror session here tomorrow. Shkoyach.